All right, so picture this. You're right in the middle of something super important on your home server, right? Maybe a big file transfer or backing up, all those vacation photos, and suddenly, boom, the whole thing crashes.
Ugh, I can feel the frustration already.
Oh, it's the worst. And, it can be a real pain with a two-node Proxmox cluster.
Ugh.
So that's what we're diving into today, Proxmox cluster stability.
Uh-huh.
Especially those two-node setups.
Yeah, those can be tricky.
Yeah, we've got a ton of articles and forum threads from people who've really been there, done that, figured out all the secrets to rock-solid reliability for these things.
And it's way more common than people think. A lot of folks start with a two-node cluster figuring, it's simple. It's an easy way to add some redundancy. But then there's this whole quorum thing that can really trip you up.
Okay, quorum. Now, that sounds a little bit like something from, a courtroom drama.
Mm.
So break it down for us. What is quorum, and why is it so important for a Proxmox cluster?
So think of it like a voting system, right? Each node in your cluster gets a vote. And for anything to happen at all, like starting a virtual machine or even just staying online, you need a majority vote.
Okay.
Now, in a two-node cluster, if one node goes down, you're stuck with a tie, right? The whole system freezes.
Yeah.
No majority, no action.
So it's basically a stalemate. Everything
Yeah.
just grinds to a halt because neither node can get that majority vote. Ouch.
Exactly. It's a recipe for disaster. But of course, there are ways around this. You don't have to be stuck in this, digital standoff every time a node has a little hiccup.
Thank goodness for that. So what are our options here?
Well, you've got two main paths you can take. You can either add a third node to your cluster or bring in something called a quorum device.
Okay, a quorum device.
Or a QDevice for short.
A QDevice. So we're talking about adding another piece of hardware to the mix here. That seems a little counterintuitive when you're trying to keep things simple with just two nodes.
I know it might seem that way, but a QDevice doesn't have to be this big, complicated server. It can be something as small and energy efficient as a Raspberry Pi.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It basically acts as a tiebreaker, casting the deciding vote if one of your main nodes goes down.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me a little Raspberry Pi can be the difference between a stable Proxmox cluster and a total meltdown?
It sounds crazy.
I know,
No.
but it's totally true. And the best part is you don't need like the latest and greatest Raspberry Pi model for this. Even an older model or even a tiny Pi Zero 2W will work. Just remember, you might need an Ethernet to USB adapter for a stable connection with the Pi Zero.
All right.
But if you happen to have a Pi 3 or 4 lying around, those are great choices too.
Right.
And you can even run some extra services on them if you want to.
Woo, extra services.
Yeah.
Now you're talking my language. So give us some examples.
Yeah.
What kind of things can we run alongside that, QDevice functionality?
Well, one that's really relevant for stability is a NUT server. That
Sure.
stands for Network UPS Tools.
This lets you monitor your UPS, your uninterruptible power supply. So you get alerts if the power goes out. And you can even have your Proxmox cluster shut down gracefully if the battery's running low. Just adding those extra layers of protection.
That's so smart. It's like a failsafe within a failsafe.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
But what if you don't have a Raspberry Pi handy? What are some other QDevice options out there?
Well, if you already have a Proxmox backup server, a PBS, you can just install the quorum service right on that. No need for extra hardware, so it's really efficient.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense for folks who are already using PBS. What about other alternatives for those of us who don't have a Raspberry Pi or a PBS just sitting around?
You could go for a mini PC, something with an Intel N100 processor or something like that. It'll be a little more powerful than a Raspberry Pi, but of course it'll draw a bit more power. This is a good option if you think you might want to run other lightweight services on it as well, alongside the QDevice.
Got it. So we've got Raspberry Pis, Proxmox, backup servers, mini PCs, all viable contenders for the QDevice crown. Are there any ways to repurpose existing hardware for this?
Absolutely. If you've got a NAS or a router that supports Docker, you might be in luck. Some Synology NAS devices, for instance, or routers that run Linux can actually run the quorum service in a Docker container. It's a great way to maximize what you've already got, and you don't have to buy something new.
Okay, let's say I'm sold on the Raspberry Pi approach. How hard is it to actually get this QDevice thing set up? Are we talking like a weekend-long project with tons of head-scratching and forum diving?
Not at all. It's surprisingly straightforward, especially if you go with Raspberry Pi OS Lite. It's a lightweight version of the operating system, perfect for these server-type applications.
Okay, walk me through the basic steps. What does the setup actually look like?
So you'll start by installing the packages you need on the Raspberry Pi. There's some great guides online that'll give you the exact commands to run. Then you'll configure your Proxmox nodes to actually use this new QDevice.
And how do I know if it's all working right? Is there a test I can run?
Yeah, you can use a simple command on your Proxmox host, pvscm status. If you see an extra vote in the output, you're golden. Your cluster's now protected against those, dreaded split brain scenarios where the nodes can't agree on who's in charge.
Fantastic. So it sounds like a Q device is pretty much essential for a stable Proxmox cluster,
Hmm.
especially with those two node setups. But I've also heard about adjusting vote weights on the nodes themselves as a way to do something similar. Is that a viable option?
It is an option, but it's not as reliable as having a dedicated Q device. The problem with just relying on vote weights is that if the node with the higher weight fails, your whole cluster goes down with it.
Ah, I see. So it's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
Whereas a Q device is more like having an independent voter giving you that extra layer of redundancy we're looking for.
Exactly. It's all about having that safety net to make sure your cluster stays up and running even when things go wrong. And with so many affordable and easy options for Q devices, there's no reason not to use one.
So we really dug into the whole Q device thing for those two-node Proxmox clusters. It's like that extra layer of protection, that keeps everything humming along smoothly. But I'm also kind of curious about that other method you mentioned, the adjusting vote weights thing. Can we maybe dive into that a little bit? When would that approach actually make sense?
Yeah, you're right to be curious about that. It's not like a one size fits all solution, but there are certain situations where it might be a good fit. Like, let's say you have a temporary setup, maybe for testing or development, where, the risk of a complete cluster failure isn't a huge deal. In those cases, just tweaking the vote weights could be a quicker and easier approach.
So it's like a temporary fix, right? Like a Band-Aid solution, whereas a Q device is more of a, long-term robust approach. But you said it's not as reliable. Could you maybe expand on the potential downsides of just relying on vote weights?
Sure. So imagine you've got your two node cluster, right? And you've given two votes to one node and one vote to the other. On the surface, it seems like you've got that majority covered even if one node goes down. But here's the catch. What if the node with those two votes fails? The whole cluster goes down because the other node doesn't have enough votes to keep things running.
Oh, I see. So even though it seems like you've got that safety net with the extra vote, you're actually creating a single point of failure.
Right.
If that one node goes down, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
That makes the Q device approach even more appealing because it's like having, an impartial judge who steps in when needed, making sure the cluster stays online.
Precisely. The Q device is like an independent entity separate from your main nodes. It's that neutral third party that keeps everything balanced and prevents one node from having too much power.
That's a great way to put it. It really shows why a Q device is usually the way to go for real stability. Okay, so we've covered Q devices pretty thoroughly. We've looked at the vote weight approach and its limitations. I feel like we've got a good handle on how to keep those Proxmox clusters happy and healthy. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, those extra services you can run on things like a Raspberry Pi. It sounds like there's a whole world of possibilities there.
Oh, there absolutely is. And it's really exciting to think about how these little low-power devices can not only help stabilize your Proxmox cluster, but also make your whole home server setup even more functional.
Give us some examples. What kind of cool stuff are we talking about? How can we turn those Raspberry Pis into multitasking superheroes?
Well, one area where these devices really shine is network monitoring and security. You can easily turn a Raspberry Pi into a network monitoring tool using open source software like Nagios or Zabbix.
Hold on, back up a sec. For those of us who aren't familiar with Nagios or Zabbix, could you give us a quick rundown of what those tools do?
Sure. Think of them as watchdogs for your network. They're constantly keeping an eye on your network devices, things like your router, your switches, even your servers, checking to see if they're online and working properly. If anything goes wrong, they'll send you alerts so you can fix it before it turns into a big problem. It's like having a 247 IT team monitoring your network.
That's amazing. Yeah. Especially for those of us who rely on a stable network for work or just, staying connected with the world. Nobody wants to be caught off guard by a sudden internet outage. So a Raspberry Pi running Nagios or Zabbix, that's a great way to stay ahead of the game and prevent those annoying downtime scenarios.
Exactly. And on the security side of things, you can even use a Raspberry Pi as a firewall or an intrusion detection system. There are dedicated operating systems like pfSense and OPNsense made specifically for this.
Okay, wait a minute. A firewall on a Raspberry Pi.
Hmm.
Doesn't that seem a little underpowered?
I know it might sound strange, but it's actually a really effective solution, especially for home networks. Remember, a firewall's main job is to filter traffic and block any bad or unauthorized connections. And a Raspberry Pi with the right software can handle that surprisingly well. Plus, it's way more energy efficient than running a whole server just for firewall duties.
I see your point. It's all about finding the right balance between functionality and resource usage. And for a home network, a Raspberry Pi firewall could be the sweet spot. What about intrusion detection? That sounds pretty high-tech.
Intrusion detection is all about being proactive and spotting any suspicious activity on your network. It's like having a security guard constantly on the lookout for anything unusual. And again, a Raspberry Pi can handle this task really well. It can analyze network traffic, look for patterns that might signal an attack, and let you know if it finds anything fishy.
So we're turning this little Raspberry Pi into a full-blown security system for our home network. This is incredible. But with all this talk about security and monitoring, are we getting a bit off track from our original topic of Proxmox cluster stability?
Not at all. Remember, stability isn't just about keeping your Proxmox cluster from crashing. It's also about creating a solid and dependable home server environment overall. And that includes having a stable and secure network.
Ah, I get what you're saying. It's about taking a holistic approach to stability.
Hmm.
We're not just focused on one piece. We're looking at the whole picture. So these Raspberry Pi uses aren't just fun side projects. They're actually helping to make our whole home server ecosystem more stable and secure.
Exactly. It's all connected. And the best part is you can start small and gradually build up your setup over time. Maybe you start with a Raspberry Pi as a QDevice for your Proxmox cluster. Then as you get more comfortable, you can explore other things, network monitoring, security, maybe even some home automation stuff.
Okay, now you're talking my language, home automation. That's a whole other world of possibilities. But before we get too carried away, let's focus on what we've covered so far. We've talked about using a Raspberry Pi as a Q device for Proxmox cluster stability, and we've explored how it can also be used for network monitoring and security. What other tricks does this little device have up its sleeves?
Well, we haven't even touched on media streaming. You can set up a Raspberry Pi as a Plex media server.
Hold on, Plex. For those of us who might not know, can you give us a quick overview?
Of course, Plex is this awesome software that lets you organize and stream your media library. Movies, TV shows, music to all sorts of devices. And a Raspberry Pi can be the server that hosts all that content. It's like having your own personal Netflix.
That's so cool. I've always wanted to set up a media server, but I always thought it would require a big server and a ton of complicated setup. You're telling me a little Raspberry Pi can handle all that?
You'd be surprised how capable these devices are, especially the newer models like the Raspberry Pi 4. They're really powerful and can handle HD video streaming without any issues. Plus, Plex is super user-friendly. There are tons of guides and resources online to help you get everything set up and running smoothly.
This is amazing. It's like you're opening up a whole new world with this one little device.
Yeah.
So we've got stability, security, and now entertainment covered. What else can we do with these Raspberry Pi workhorses?
Well, if you're feeling adventurous, you can even dive into the world of home automation using a Raspberry Pi.
Home automation. Okay, now you're really speaking my language. I'm already picturing myself controlling all the lights and appliances in my house from my phone. Tell me more.
Think of the Raspberry Pi as the brain of your smart home. You can connect it to all kinds of devices, lights, thermostats, security systems, even things like your coffee maker. And with the right software, and there are tons of options out there, you can create custom automation routines to make your life way easier and more efficient.
This is incredible. I can already see myself waking up to freshly brewed coffee every morning, all thanks to my trusty Raspberry Pi. It's like having a personal assistant, taking care of all the little things so I can focus on the important stuff.
Exactly. And the best part is you don't have to be a coding expert to get started with home automation. There are platforms out there made for beginners that make it super easy to create simple automation routines. Then as you get more comfortable, you can explore more advanced options and really make your setup your own.
I'm starting to see how these Raspberry Pis can really change the game for a home server setup. They're versatile, affordable, and surprisingly powerful. But I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface of what's possible with these little devices.
We've definitely covered a lot today, but there's always more to explore. And that's what makes home servers so exciting. It's a constant journey of discovery, experimentation, and pushing the limits of what's possible.
It's crazy how much we've talked about just from these little Raspberry Pis. Who knew they could do so much?
It really is amazing. And it kind of shows a bigger trend in technology, this whole idea of making tools and knowledge available to everyone. It used to be that setting up a server, even a home server, felt like this really difficult, exclusive thing. But now with devices like the Raspberry Pi and all the info online, it's easier than ever for anyone to just jump in and start building their own systems.
It's so true. It's like that whole DIY thing has moved into tech. Yeah. And the open source community is a big part of that too. A lot of the software we've talked about today, Proxmox, Nagios, Zabbix, Plex, it's all open source, which means it's always being improved and made better by a huge community of developers and users all over the world.
Yeah, that collaborative spirit is really what drives innovation and makes technology more accessible for everyone. And, as we see these low-power computers getting even better, I think we're going to see some really creative and groundbreaking uses for them.
I can't wait to see what comes next. But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to our main topic for today. Proxmox cluster stability.
Yeah.
We've talked about Q devices, vote weights, all this cool stuff you can do with a Raspberry Pi. But if someone's listening to this, maybe they're new to Proxmox and they're feeling a little overwhelmed by all the options, what's the one thing they should take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that making your Proxmox cluster stable doesn't have to be complicated or expensive. A simple, affordable device like a Raspberry Pi can be all you need for a rock-solid setup. And once you have that, you can start exploring all these other possibilities for making your home server even better.
I love that. Start with stability, and then let your curiosity be your guide. It's all about learning, experimenting, and seeing what's possible with technology.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There's a great community of home server enthusiasts out there who are always happy to help and share what they know.
That's what's so great about this whole community, that spirit of collaboration and support.
Yeah.
So to all our listeners out there, whether you're a Proxmox expert or just starting out, don't be afraid to dive in, ask questions, and share what you discover with the world.
Well said. Keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Proxmox cluster stability and the amazing world of low-power computing. We hope you learned some valuable stuff today and feel inspired to build your own rock-solid and versatile home server setup.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep on tinkering.